This video is a remaster of my air combat retrospective that was published on December 10th, 2022. I've gone through the original script and added, removed, and adjusted things as necessary in order to fix things like the pacing, grammar, any errors, etc. I also made sure the gameplay isn't stretched out this time around. With all that being said, sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy this remaster of my air combat retrospective. When talking about a video game franchise, in the midst of all the talk about the latest entry, I personally think it's just as entertaining, and also important, to take a look back and see the earlier titles. Even if a player has no interest in playing those earlier titles, I think that it's still important to take a look at them, especially the first entries in a franchise. If the conversation around whatever game in question goes quiet for long enough, there's a good chance it may fade into obscurity forever. Now, I'm not saying this possibility is exclusive to video games. If a conversation about anything goes stale for long enough, that fate can happen to it. But given how unique video games are as a form of media, I feel that it's especially important here. Combine this interest of looking at and playing games of the past with my favorite video game series of all time, and what we have is a video talking about the very first Ace Combat game ever made. In order to talk about this game's development as a whole properly, firstly, we have to talk about the name of it. In Japan, the game is known as Ace Combat, but for everywhere else, it's known as Air Combat. Because I made the fatal mistake of being born in the country where someone saying they'll call an ambulance is a threat and not an act of kindness, I'll be referring to this game as Air Combat. To avoid any confusion though, Air Combat and Ace Combat are the same game, just with different names in different countries. Secondly, to talk about this game's development properly, we have to go way back, to the very beginning. And no, I'm not using this as an intentional cliche overused line joke, I mean we have to take a look at a different game first. This game would go on to be the reason Air Combat was born in the first place. This is Air Combat. No, that's not a typo, nor is it a misreading of the script on my part. Despite these two games sharing the exact same name, the 1993 Air Combat is an arcade cabinet game. Air Combat, the arcade cabinet game, has you taking off in an F-16 to shoot down as many enemies as possible while under a time limit. Each enemy you shoot down gives you a time extension, making the game about shooting down as many enemies as possible to get the highest score before the time runs out. Simple arcade game stuff. The reason this game is related to how Air Combat the PlayStation 1 game came to be is because originally, the PlayStation 1 game was supposed to be a console port of the arcade game. Masanori Kato and Kazumi Mizuno were ordered by the company they worked for, Namco, to make this port happen. Those two, along with the small number of people working on the game alongside them, ran into issues with the PS1's hardware. Despite the fact that this system was considered the cutting edge of technology console-wise at the time, there wasn't enough power under the hood to be able to handle a direct port of the arcade game. So, early on in development, they decided to scrap the arcade port entirely and instead make a new game. Sadly, from what I could find, there aren't any mentions of how the leadership at Namco reacted upon being told how the arcade port they wanted was scrapped and a whole new game would be taking its place instead. They probably went, "Wait, what?" or something like that. Especially since at the time, Namco was known for its arcade to console ports. This entirely new PS1 version was still inspired by the arcade cabinet game, as a lot of arcade elements are present, such as the constant action, reloading missiles, rock-focused soundtrack, etc. However, the pace of combat, the environments, the objectives, the presentation, decisions for the player to make, and more all make Air Combat the PS1 game stand out. In the beginning, we were told by the company to create a port of the arcade version of Ace Combat. However, even though the original PlayStation console was the culmination of the best technology available at the time, it still wasn't powerful enough to match the performance of arcade machines. Not to mention, the team members consisted of one naval ship fanatic and 3 others who had no knowledge of airplanes. In the end, we just decided to forget about creating a port and instead made a game from scratch. Kazutoki Kono adds on to the fact that Air Combat the PS1 game was never meant to replicate the arcade cabinet game. Yeah, the PS1 game was originally supposed to be an arcade-to-console port. However, once the team decided to make their own version of Ace Combat, they chose to refrain from making a watered-down version of the arcade game. But the goal with Ace Combat wasn't to make a 100% complete replication of Air Combat. The first entry in the series was an attempt to take the ease of control from the arcade game and match it with content that fit what the home console market wanted. Hey, I made it through without a voice crack this time.
But the goal with... What the f*** was that voice crack?
If the team set out to create a console version that was a direct copy, that copy would have been known as the dollar store version of the arcade game. Masanori Kato stated that the PS1 wasn't able to match the performance of arcade machines, meaning if he and the others set out to replicate Air Combat the arcade game, lots of sacrifices would have had to happen, whether it be drops in visual quality, the environment's not loading in as far, a reduction in the quality of the sound effects, you name it. Air Combat also had a lot of ideas that ended up being cut from the final build. Originally, there were plans for in-game replays to occur after each mission. Another thing that was originally planned to be part of the core gameplay was mission conditions changing depending on how you played through the campaign. In Air Combat, the way you choose missions is by freely selecting which one you want to go to next from a given selection depending on how far in the campaign you are. Even though the missions may have numbers to them, nothing is stopping you from picking a different mission. However, there isn't much in the way of replayability in terms of how the enemy reacts to the order in which you choose the missions because, well, the enemy doesn't react. I'll provide specific examples of this when talking about the gameplay. One last notable gameplay mechanic that was cut was a takeoff/landing minigame, or at least cut before the game launched. After the game was approved for launch, the developers added that in and got it to work, meaning Air Combat technically does have a takeoff/landing minigame, but those copies of the game are only for the developers. What's interesting to me about these mechanics being cut from the game is the reasoning for it. The developers wanted to make the best game possible, and it was clear that they were ambitious and innovative when handling this project. It was the inexperience with the hardware at the time that stopped them in certain areas. However, as the Ace Combat series continued and as the devs gained more experience, along with new and better hardware being introduced later down the line, features that previously weren't possible were gradually added as the series went on. I know that I usually start with the gameplay first and then talk about the story after, but the story in this game is so short, sweet, and to the point that it's better if I get this out of the way first. This segment is going to be quick. In Air Combat, you play as Scarface 1, call sign Phoenix, a mercenary pilot hired by some government. No specific names are given here. The Ace Combat wiki even refers to the nation hiring Scarface Squadron as just the legitimate government. The legitimate government hires Scarface Squadron to fight terrorist forces who have launched a well-coordinated coup d'etat. Repeated retaliatory attacks by the legitimate government have failed, which has led them to call upon mercenaries for help. Phoenix and the others of Scarface Squadron are then sent on various missions to eliminate the coup forces and to re-establish the legitimate government. It may seem incredibly basic to have the plot boil down to, we're hiring you to fight these coup d'etat forces. You'll be paid handsomely for it. Now get out there and fight. But because this was the very first Ace Combat game to ever be made, I think it was a safe play to have the story be this simple. It also doesn't help that since the devs were still figuring things out when it came to harnessing all of the PS1's power, that prevented anything majorly cinematic being done. That, and given the game's literal arcade inspirations, a deep and complex story would sort of feel out of place to begin with. Later entries would introduce and normalize more in-depth stories, but for this game, the story is definitely on the more basic side, which I think fits well here. The best way that I can describe how Air Combat plays is that it plays like a prototype. Given that this is the very first entry in the Ace Combat series, that phrase can be interpreted more literally here. Usually when someone is reviewing a game, the phrase "it plays like a prototype" means the game plays poorly. By today's standards, Air Combat is very clunky, but I do have to be more generous given how long ago this game came out. Before talking about that though, let's talk about the gameplay mechanics before you go on a mission. This is the mission selection screen. There are a total of 17 missions in the campaign, and once you complete mission 4, the game begins to branch out, allowing you to complete whatever missions in whatever order you wish as you progress further. Even though the missions are numbered, there's nothing stopping you from jumping forward or backward, and there's no difficulty spike that forces you to go down a certain path. Each mission earns you a lot of credits, along with giving you new planes to purchase that get better and better the further you progress. No matter how you complete the campaign, the game's difficulty curve is excellently paced to match how far into the campaign you are, regardless of the path you take to get there. Unfortunately, there's no reactivity from the enemy depending on what paths you take. I briefly mentioned this when talking about the development of this game, and here's where I want to go more in depth with it. It's not a game-breaking thing that the enemy doesn't react to your moves, but it does still feel a little weird at times. Take Mission 8 for example, Destroy Enemy Staging Zone. This mission has you destroying an aerial fleet of bombers and escorts before they can strike Donetsk City, a city that you liberated earlier in the campaign. No matter how long you wait to take on this mission, the enemy aerial fleet will never take off until you take on the mission. In a different timeline perhaps, if you waited too long to attack the group of enemy bombers, they could set off for their target, and for the next mission, you would have to intercept them over Donetsk City. Another example can be found with Mission 7, Suppress Radar Base. The briefing officer states that a steep drop in enemy effectiveness will occur if this radar site is destroyed. However, there is no noticeable drop in enemy performance of any sort when this is destroyed. There's no discernible difference between when the radar site is up versus when it's down. In an alternate timeline perhaps, upon the destruction of the radar base, for the next 2 or 3 missions, you'd get some sort of advantage. By the end of that second or third mission, the enemy could build a new radar site back at their HQ to return them to their normal fighting status to balance the game out. Again, it's not a deal breaker, and later games like Ace Combat X would fully realize a system like this when the technology would allow for it. But having the enemy just sitting around when they're surrounded on all sides or being told an effect will happen and then it doesn't can be a bit bizarre. When you go out on a mission, you'll first be given a briefing on what the objective is. After that, depending on the mission, you'll be given the choice to either launch with a wingman or launch solo. For the first 3 missions, you're only given the option to fly solo. Once you reach mission 4, taking on missions with a wingman becomes possible. There are some missions deeper in the campaign where you can only fly solo, but for most of the missions after the 3rd one, you have that option. The first few wingmen are rookies, but as you progress through the campaign, more efficient wingmen become available. The better the wingman, the more expensive it'll be to hire them for that mission. Though with how many credits you get per mission, hiring wingmen isn't an issue. Before you officially hire a wingman for a mission, you have to tell them what to do. Usually, you tell them to either cover your 6, where they fly close to you and intercept anyone trying to shoot you down, or you can tell them to go off and do their own thing. Occasionally, there will also be a third option where you can tell the wingman to focus on a specific objective area. Once you either hire a wingman or choose to fly solo, it's time for you to pick your aircraft. You start out with either 3, 2, or just 1 aircraft depending on whether you pick the easy, normal, or hard difficulty. To get new aircraft, you have to visit the aircraft viewer menu, where all of the available aircraft up to that point are available to purchase. At the bottom right of the aircraft selection screen, the aircraft stats are given with circles. The more filled the circle is, the more powerful that particular stat is. Each aircraft has its strengths and weaknesses that need to be taken into consideration. Especially more so in this game, since the way of acquiring new aircraft and what happens to that aircraft if you get shot down works a lot differently than how it does in the other Ace Combat titles. If you end up getting shot down, the game will return to the mission select screen, allowing you to either pick that mission again or choose a different one. But when you get to the aircraft selection screen, the aircraft you flew on that previous mission will be gone. And if you hired a wingman for that previous mission, you have to rehire that wingman. Of course, this can all be circumvented by save scumming. However, given this game's arcade inspirations, a single playthrough from start to finish without any saves is possible, making that risk-reward system more prevalent if you wish to engage with it. For reference, I was able to finish the game in a little over 2 hours. Alright, now that we've talked about all of that, we can finally talk about what goes on during the actual missions themselves. This game has aged so poorly when it comes to how it looks and controls. For the visuals, as poor as they are by today's standards, I do have to be lenient since these were the best graphics the developers had to work with at the time. And ultimately, aside from Mission 4 where it's set during the nighttime which makes it kinda difficult to see things, the visuals never caused me any issues when it came to flying around and fighting the enemies. That, and we can look at this in a positive light, how the graphics of the first Ace Combat title look compared to how the latest entry in the series today looks. It really puts into perspective how far not just the Ace Combat series, but gaming as a whole has come. Now onto the controls. Right away, I noticed that no matter what aircraft I picked, it was behaving in an odd manner. Not in a way of the aircraft doing things it shouldn't be able to do. That's just the norm for Ace Combat. Rather, it felt like the aircraft wasn't as responsive as it should have been. Like I had to fight with my aircraft to get it to face where I precisely wanted to go at times. Reason being, there are no analog stick controls in this game. In case anyone doesn't know what I mean, the PlayStation 1 has 2 different controllers. The very first controller design, the one one that the PS1 launched with does not have analog sticks. It just has the D-pad and all the other buttons to go with it. The dual analog controller wasn't released until 1997, meaning the only kind of controller that existed for the PS1 when Air Combat was being developed was the one without analog sticks. Why am I placing such a huge emphasis on the analog sticks in relation to why this game feels clunky to play? Well, in order for me to answer that question, I need to not get mathematical. I'm not gonna make that mistake again. God, that part of my original video was so bad. It was absolute dog shit, dude. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, in my original retrospective, I went on a whole tangent about the degrees of a circle and why that was superior to the 4 general directions of a D-pad. I thought I was being so cool by being so technical and mathematical with everything. Like, I remember editing that part of my original upload and going, oh yeah, it's all coming together. Only for that to be the most criticized part of the video. And rightfully so, because God, I hate that part of the video nowadays too. So to keep it simple here in the remaster, analog sticks are better because they have a variety of different angles, whereas the 4 general directions of a D-pad aren't nearly as precise because, well, just look at it. Let's talk about how combat works next. The way combat works in this game is simple. You get the enemy in your sights, wait to hear the lock-on tone along with the box turning red, and you fire your missiles. With this being the very first Ace Combat game, special weapons aren't a thing here. Special weapons wouldn't become a thing until Ace Combat 3 and would be adjusted into how we know them today starting with Ace Combat 4. All you have here in Air Combat are standard missiles and your cannon. Thankfully, I never felt overwhelmed with enemies while being restricted to just standard missiles. Even when there were a ton of targets all around, I was able to go around destroying them one at a time until the end of the mission. The cannon, on the other hand, isn't very effective in this game simply because of the fact that it has no range to it. Obviously, the cannon shouldn't be a sniper rifle, but at the same time, it should be a close-ranged weapon, not a no-ranged weapon. Take a look at how close I have to be to these oil tanks in order to get hits.
Enemy locked on target. Altitude too low. Climb.
I can't imagine what a cannon-only playthrough of this game would be like. The missiles work a lot better in comparison, but they occasionally have issues with tracking targets as well. It seems to be random. Sometimes you'll score a hit where it seemed like you'd miss, and then other times when you launch a missile, it just decides to f*** off far into the distance. Another issue with the missiles is with how the game portrays a hit versus a kill. No matter whether you just hit a target with a missile versus destroy the target with a missile, you get the same bingo text on the screen along with your wizzo who joins you in missions exclaiming in excitement.
An enemy in sight. Fire! Shoot it down! Great shot!
Or is that Scarface One himself breaking the fourth wall and talking to you, since that voice is there even when you fly single-seat aircraft?
Bogey on our 6. Bingo! Yahoo!
Caution.
That seems more fitting for when you destroy the target, not just hit it. The problem is, it can be confusing on whether you hit or destroy the target since that happens either way. For example, whenever you play chicken with an enemy aircraft and fire missiles at it head-on, regardless of whether you just hit or full-on destroy it, that bingo text and audible exclamation occurs. This can cause some confusion for a few seconds as you then look to your radar to double-check whether the target was just hit or destroyed. Once you get used to it, it becomes less of an issue, but it absolutely caused some confusion for me. Ace Combat 2 and 3 would opt to only confirm when an enemy was destroyed, with the first instance of the game visually telling a player when a target was hit but not destroyed being in Ace Combat 4. Another thing I have to talk about regarding the gameplay is with the 2 different perspectives you can choose from. This game has 2 different camera options, a front and rear camera. The front camera gives you tons of information, including exact numbers for how many missiles and cannon rounds you have left, your speed and altitude, plus your radar and health. The rear camera, in comparison, only shows you a visual representation of how many missiles you have left and your damage. In this game, using the front-facing camera is a flat-out necessity given the amount of information that's on the screen. For players who wish to use the rear camera when playing, unlike in modern-day Ace Combat titles, it isn't a matter of preference here. It's a matter of whether you're willing to sacrifice important information for being able to see your plane when fighting. Especially when performing ground attacks, using the front camera is almost a requirement as the game does not interpret low-altitude flying very well. This means the player needs to reference the altitude meter to judge how low they can go. The graphics can easily mislead the player into thinking they have more altitude available to them than what they actually have. Ace Combat 2 would remedy the issue of critical heads-up display elements not showing up when using the rear camera by, well, displaying the critical heads-up display elements when in the rear camera. But this is another reason why air combat can be clunky to play today. Moving on to a positive aspect of the gameplay, I have to commend air combat for its mission variety. Given its arcade roots, it would have been normal, perhaps even expected, if the game had only air-to-air combat and nothing else. But in this game, you have air-to-air combat, along with missions such as defending a VIP transport, destroying an enemy naval fleet, destroying an oil field the enemy is utilizing, fighting a massive aerial fortress, and more. I would go as far as to say that because air combat had this mission variety, that would become a core gameplay aspect that developers would take into consideration when developing the future entries. Another great thing I have to point out about this game is the music. The rock-focused soundtrack is composed by, I presume, Hiroyuki Kawada, Kazuhiro Nakamura, and Keishi Okabe. I say presume because they're listed under sound when the credits display the special thanks that gives credit to Air Combat 22 staff for helping with this game. Air Combat 22 being the arcade cabinet sequel to the arcade cabinet Air Combat. But by sound, the game could just mean the general sound design. Air Combat 22's composers are these three, so I'm going to roll with them being the composers for Air Combat. If this is wrong and the composers are different people, please let me know, because this was a bit of a head scratcher to figure out, even for this remaster. In any case, the rock-focused soundtrack adds on to the arcade-like nature of the game. The tracks themselves are short, usually ranging anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, but each track empowers you, further giving you that intense feeling of being the badass ace pilot you're meant to be. The music of Ace Combat obviously wasn't as well known yet because this was the very first Ace Combat game ever, but even for the very first entry, the music here is great. Another neat thing about this game is that it has a decent selection of cheats available to use. After you press R1 and the circle button, or whatever other buttons you have them set to through emulation, you get taken to a secret loading screen with these flying discs. It's here that you can enter in cheats while the discs are still spinning. When you enter in a cheat correctly, a character from one of Namco's other IPs will appear at the bottom left of the screen. Given how you can activate these cheats within DuckStation, the cheat screen here is made redundant nowadays, but it's still cool that this was implemented in the first place. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. Air Combat is a very clunky game to play today. I can only recommend playing this game to die-hard Ace Combat fans, and even then, you have to go into this with the right mindset. While Air Combat is a very clunky game to play today, a lot of why that's the case is due to the developers not being super familiar with the PS1 at the time. And again, it's the very first Ace Combat game ever. You're not gonna get everything 100% right on your first try at anything in life. Air Combat was quite literally the prototype game of this franchise. Therefore, I have to be more forgiving towards it. I also have to admit, it was really neat, all things considered, to play the very first Ace Combat game, to see how my favorite video game series of all time began. It's also interesting to think that without this game, the series wouldn't have evolved. We probably wouldn't have gotten the PS2 Holy Trinity. We probably wouldn't have gotten Ace Combat 7. We could have avoided Assault Horizon though. My point is, without this first step, without Air Combat, this series would have gone in an entirely different direction, or perhaps not have gone in any direction to begin with. If Air Combat wasn't a thing, Ace Combat may not have become a thing at all. Later entries would refine and improve the experience into what the series is known for today. For Air Combat, this is the game that began what is nowadays a hugely successful video game series. This is why I said at the beginning of this video that it's important that we continue acknowledging and talking about older video games like this, especially when it comes to the very first titles in a series. To look at how Ace Combat began and then to look at how far it's come since then really puts into perspective just how much the Ace Combat series and gaming as a whole has evolved. Even if Air Combat isn't the greatest feeling game to play nowadays, its role in kickstarting the Ace Combat franchise can't be denied.